In this tutorial, I'll explain the Eclipse code generation procedure. As we have seen, a basic Hibernate example consists of lot of files. There are two parts of any project. First is the project setting, then we have the ORM settings. The project setting consists of the following files. The project setting consists of the Hibernate configuration file and the session factory. This is one-time setting for the project, the Hibernate configuration file and the session factory. For the whole project, you need only one configuration file and only one session factory. Next, we have the ORM settings. For every table, you will have a ORM. Say we have a particular table, you will have POJOs and then the mapping files. Finally, we have the test program. So any Hibernate flow consists of total 5 files. The Hibernate configuration file, the session factory, the table, the POJO and mapping file. Before you start developing an application, you have to get all the 5 files ready. That is a lot of work. You cannot sit and waste your time writing all these files. Most of this code can be auto-generated by using Eclipse plugins. We have different plugins available which will be able to auto-generate most of this code. Right now I'm going to use JBoss Hibernate Tools. JBoss Hibernate Tools is the free plugin provided by Hibernate. We can make use of this JBoss Hibernate Tools to auto-generate most of these files. The Hibernate configuration file, the table, the POJO and the mapping file. I can auto-generate the Hibernate configuration file, and then if I have the table, from the table I can automatically generate the POJO. I can also automatically generate the mapping file. So from the table, you will be able to automatically generate POJO and the mapping file. This is called as reverse engineering. That is, if you have the table, you will be able to automatically generate POJO and the mapping file. This is called as reverse engineering procedure. Now I will explain the Eclipse code generation procedure. The procedure is fairly very simple, but you should do it very carefully. Then only you will be able to auto-generate the code. The procedure consists of 3 stages. I have 3 steps to perform. Step 1 is the project setup. Step 2 is called as the console configuration. Step 3 is called as the reverse engineering procedure. Step 1 is the project setup. Step 2 is the console configuration. Step 3 is the reverse engineering procedure. And then I have few more extra steps to perform. End of this, you will be able to auto-generate most of the code and make the example running. In step 1, you create a project and add Hibernate and MySQL jars. In the step 1, you create a project and add Hibernate and MySQL jars. Step 2 is called as the console configuration, which involves setting up database connection in Eclipse and creating the Hibernate configuration file. In step 1, you create a project and add the required jars. In step 2, you set up database connection and create a Hibernate configuration file. Step 3 is called as the reverse engineering procedure. Step 3 is called as the reverse engineering procedure. In step 3, starting from a table, you can automatically generate the POJO and the mapping file. Apart from this, we have a few extra things to perform. For this demonstration, I am using the following softwares. I am using Eclipse with JBoss tools. Second, I am using Hibernate jars. And then I use the MySQL jars. That is the MySQL connector. I am using MySQL connector.jar. That is the MySQL driver. And then I am using WAMP server. That is MySQL database. I am using Eclipse with JBoss tools. I am using Hibernate jars. I am using MySQL connector.jar file. I am using MySQL database through WAMP server. You can use WAMP or SAMP or any other ways of setting up MySQL. I am using Eclipse with JBoss tools, Hibernate jars, MySQL connector and the WAMP server. I'll be providing these softwares. Right now you don't worry about getting the required softwares. You only concentrate on the procedure. I will be providing all these softwares. You only concentrate on the procedure, which I am going to explain. I'll start with step 1. Step 1 is the project setup, which consists of creating a project, adding the Hibernate and MySQL jars. Create the project, add Hibernate and MySQL jars. Go and create a simple Java project. Click on finish. Now right click on the project, go to build path, configure build path, libraries, add external jars. From the jar files you have downloaded from the Hibernate website, you add the following jars. You add all the jars from the Hibernate required folder. You add all the jars from the Hibernate required folder. Again you click on add external jars. This time you have to add the MySQL connector jar files. With that I have completed the step 1. Step 1 is about creating the project and then adding the Hibernate jars and the MySQL jars. I have added the Hibernate jars and the MySQL jar. You have to add only the jars in the required folder. Rest of the jars are not required right now. Step 2 is the console configuration. This involves setting up database connection in Eclipse and setting up the Hibernate configuration file. Step 2 consists of setting up the database connection in Eclipse and creating the Hibernate configuration file. Before performing step 2, you change the perspective of Eclipse. Go to Window, Open Perspective, Other, and change the perspective to Hibernate. Now I will perform the step 2, that is to create a console configuration. File, New, Hibernate console configuration. File, New, Hibernate console configuration. Step 2 is the console configuration, which consists of two things. One is setting up the database connection. Another is to set up the Hibernate configuration file. The rest of the things are not required. In step 2, we have to set up the database connection and then set up the Hibernate configuration file. First is to set up the database connection to MySQL database. So you keep your connection parameters ready and then click on the new button. We are creating a connection to MySQL database. So select MySQL. You can give a nickname for the connection. This name you can use it for your reference. You can give any connection name. I am giving the same name as my database name for my reference. It asks for a driver. So you click on this small icon. This icon is not easily visible. You carefully select it. I am using MySQL 5.1 version. Select that, remove this and add the jar file. I have added the driver for MySQL 5.1 version. Now you give the connection URL. JDBC is the protocol, MySQL is the subprotocol. The machine, the port number and the name of the database. Still now I have not created a database. So I open WAMP server and create a database. This is my WAMP server which is started. You go create some database. I create a database called as August 28. Now I have a database in MySQL. JDBC is the protocol, MySQL is the subprotocol. The machine, the port number, the name of the database is August 28. There is no password. You click test connection. Ping succeeded. You click on finish. With that, I have set up the database connection as part of console configuration. As part of console configuration, we also have to set up the Hibernate configuration file. Click on the setup and create a new Hibernate configuration file. Here you pass all the parameters for the Hibernate configuration file. Session factory, don't fill it. Database dialect is MySQL. Now I'll get some suggestions for MySQL. I'm using com MySQL JDBC driver. The connection URL, the protocol, subprotocol, machine is localhost. Name of the database I am using is August 28. I give the username. I don't have the password. Password is empty. In this screen, these are the only properties I have set. I set up the database dialect, the driver class, that is com MySQL JDBC driver, the connection URL and the username. These are the only 4 things you need to fill right now. Rest of the options are not required. You click on finish. With that, I have completed the console configuration, which consists of setting up the database connection and also setting up the Hibernate configuration file. Setting up the database connection and setting up the Hibernate configuration file. You can click on finish now. At the end of step 2, you can see that a Hibernate configuration file is generated with the same parameters what I passed just now. The driver class, the connection URL, the username and the dialect. Just now I have completed the console configuration, which consists of setting up database connection in Eclipse and the Hibernate configuration file setup. Now I'll go to step 3. Step 3 is the last step, that is the reverse engineering procedure. As part of the reverse engineering procedure, I will have a table created manually. Once I have the table created, from the table I can automatically generate the POJO and the mapping file. That is the reverse engineering procedure. Now I will create a table. Later, by using JBoss Tools plugin, I will auto-generate the POJO and the mapping file. Step 3 is the reverse engineering procedure. For that, you go and look carefully at this icon and pull it down. Here you can see the Hibernate logo. You pull it down and go to Hibernate Code Generation Configuration. Go to Hibernate Code Generation Configuration. Before performing step 3, first you should create a table. I create a simple table called as the employee table. I create 3 columns: employee ID, employee name and employee email. Employee ID I mark it as primary key. Make sure you always have a primary key column. So now I have created a table with 3 columns: employee ID, employee name, employee email. Employee ID, make sure you mark it as primary key. That is the employee table what we have created. Now I have the employee table ready in the August 28 database. Next we'll perform the reverse engineering procedure. The reverse engineering procedure starts with pulling down this drop down. Here you see a small logo of Hibernate. You pull it down and go to Hibernate Code Generation Configuration. You pull down this logo and go to Hibernate Code Generation Configuration. Follow the wizard. End of the wizard, you will get all the code generated. Initially you will see an empty space. You click on Hibernate Code Generation Configuration. You click on Hibernate Code Generation and click on New. I am setting up a new code generation configuration. You should look at this carefully and do it. Click on this icon. Now we have a new code generation configuration. Click on this and you will have a new code generation configuration. Here you have to fill the name of the console configuration and then we fill the reverse engineering wizard. First you choose the console configuration. Name of the console configuration is my project. Click on output directory. Some code is going to be auto generated where you want to place the code. I say that I want to keep the code in the SRC folder. All the generated code I will be placing in the SRC folder. Next you select on the reverse engineering procedure. Here you set up the reverse engineering XML file. Select reverse engineer from JDBC connection. Click on the reverse engineering XML file and set up a new reverse engineering file. Click on create new Hibernate Reverse Engineering XML file. Say that the file has to be placed in the SRC folder. The file has to be placed in the SRC folder. Click on next. Now you click on refresh. Select the table which you want to reverse engineer. Select the employee table, include and click finish. Still now I have selected the console configuration. The name of the console configuration has come from my previous step. I have configured the reverse engineering XML. Next you click on the export as tab. And select what you need to be generated. I want the domain code, that is the POJO, and the mapping file to be auto generated. Now you click on the run button. You can see that all the required files are generated. From the table we have generated the POJO and also the mapping file. Also we have generated the Hibernate configuration file initially. Now we have few more extra steps to perform. Just now I have completed the reverse engineering procedure. I started from the table. From the table I have generated the POJO and the mapping file. Now I'll go to the last step. This is some small extra step to perform. You have to write the session factory and then load the mapping resource in the configuration file. Write the session factory. I'm not going to write the session factory. You can copy the session factory code from somewhere. Then you load the mapping resource in the configuration file. I'll perform both the steps. I copy the session factory class from somewhere and paste it here. The session factory loads the Hibernate configuration file and creates session objects. As part of the extra step, now I have to go to the Hibernate configuration file and load the mapping resource. In the Hibernate configuration file, you should configure the name of all the mapping resources. Click on Add and select the name of your mapping resource. You click on Add Mapping and add mapping resource, not mapping class. You add the mapping resource. Choose the mapping file, employee.hpm.xml file. Click on Finish. If you look at the source code, you can see that mapping file has been added in the Hibernate configuration file. We have the mapping resources added in the Hibernate configuration file. There is one very important thing to do. Always have a look at the Hibernate configuration file. If you see something like name equal to empty string, just delete it. I don't want this name equal to empty string, so I just delete it. Otherwise you'll see some exceptions. Now I have completed all the steps. Step 1 is to create the project and add the jars. Step 2 is the console configuration, in which I have set up the database connection and configured the Hibernate configuration file. Step 3 is the reverse engineering procedure. I have reverse engineered the table and generated POJOs and mapping file. And then I have also set up the session factory and loaded the mapping resource in the configuration file. Now I have completed all the steps. The whole set of Hibernate files are generated now. As part of the project settings, I have the Hibernate configuration file generated. The session factory I have copy pasted. The table I have created, the POJO and mapping automatically generated. Now I have all the 5 files required for the project and ORM settings. After this, I can develop a small application. I can develop a small test program right now, which will try to insert some data into the database. Go and write a small test program. First I have to create a session object. I have opened the session. I have closed the session. I started the transaction. I am committing the transaction after performing the database operation. The operation here is to store some employee data. Session.save is the method for storing data. Now when I run the program, Hibernate will automatically generate an SQL and try to insert this data into the database. If you want to see the generated SQL query, then you go to the Hibernate configuration file and add a property. Name of the property is show SQL. You set it to true. If you set the show SQL to true, you can see the SQL query generated by Hibernate. Now you right click on the test program and run as Java application. You can see that a insert query is generated. Now if you look at the database table, data has been inserted into the table.